So, the Supercars at Phillip Island wrapped up yesterday, and first, I think we need to rejoice that the lack of tyre blowouts this weekend, the reversion back to the 2016 spec tyre, seems to have been the right call, because anyone that watched the round last year will know it's a complete farce. So, the tyre changes ultimately led to a couple of decent races. Let's talk about them. So the Saturday race started with Scott McLaughlin on pole position from Jamie Whincup after Fabian Coulthard was disqualified from qualifying with an anomaly with the rear wing, which was a bit of a interesting thing to happen for a team like Penske. There were a lot of mistakes from the top teams this weekend, but away from the line, Scott and Jamie had pretty equal starts, but it was Jamie that went around the outside of Scott into turn one of the best corners on the calendar, and this was a fantastic move by Whincup, incredibly ballsy to keep it there on cold tyres. Very good effort and kind of payback for 2016 where he tried the same move on McLaughlin and ended up going wide. So he led early. The biggest moment on lap one was Mark Winterbottom, who was celebrating his 200th round at the Hayshed turn 8, where he was forced off the track at the fast right-hander by Garth Tander and only just managed to keep the car in check and from careering into the rest of the field. So that was a good save from him. And from this point on, the race kind of settled into a bit of a steady groove, and a bit of a pattern emerged with McLaughlin and Whincup at the front. They were a long way ahead of everyone else. So what basically happened was at the start of each stint, it appeared that Whincup would pull away, and then McLaughlin would just come back towards him, whether it was just set up or better tyre life for McLaughlin. It did appear that way. So McLaughlin was eventually able to get past Jamie towards the end of the race, around lap 35, I think it was, with an excellent move. He cut back, went wide around turn 1 and cut back into turn 2 and forced his car down the inside of Whincup. He pulled off an identical move on the Sunday as well, which I'll get to, but Whincup didn't quite have the pace to stay with McLaughlin in this race, but it wasn't a faultless race from Shell V-Power either. It was in the first stop of the race. The team were intending, this is when McLaughlin was still behind Whincup, they were intending to get McLaughlin out ahead by underfilling him slightly, but they mistimed this somewhat, and it ended up with a bit of an awkward moment where McLaughlin had to awkwardly slot in behind Jamie Whincup, but he was eventually able to get the move done. But a bit of work to do for Penske, particularly with their pit stops, as we'll see again on the Sunday. Now, behind the leading two, there was a bit of a cool story emerging with Rick Kelly in the Nissan getting his first podium in over 2 years, and on his 500th race. He wasn't particularly excited by the fact that it was his 500th race. He was more looking at the fact that it was a podium for the team. This could be particularly important for Nissan, considering that they're currently still deciding whether to keep going with their supercar team. But it was a great drive from Rick and great strategy from the team. Rick Kelly was 6th on the grid, and during the first round of stops, they underfilled him, which they jumped Shane Van Gisbergen and Craig Lowndes, put themselves up into 3rd place, and his pace was good enough that he was able to counteract the lack of fuel in the first stop and still come out ahead of them after the second stop. He came under attack a bit from Craig Lowndes at the end, but he wasn't able to get past, and that resulted in one of the more controversial moments of the race, where Shane Van Gisbergen had let Craig Lowndes pass and then expected the spot to be given back, which I don't think anyone had told Craig Lowndes, so he wasn't particularly happy about that. The fans weren't particularly happy about that, and I think it was potentially a little unfair. Lowndes was clearly faster, and he probably would have got past Van Gisbergen anyway, even without the team orders, and I think it's a bit early in the season to be sacrificing someone else's points for another, particularly when it's this early in the season. But Shane Van Gisbergen eventually coming, he placed 4th, but he'll get 3rd, as I'll talk about in a minute. That was a pretty superhuman effort from him, probably the drive of the day, considering that he had intermittent power steering issues, which means that he was sometimes losing the power steering, which made the steering incredibly heavy, and then it would just cut back in, and then the wheel would probably go a bit the other way. But for him around one of the highest amounts of turning on a track in Australia, for him to still come third place was an absolutely superhuman effort. And the rest of the top 10 was Chaz Moster. It was nice to see them with a bit more pace compared to where they were at Tasmania, where they were absolutely nowhere. David Reynolds and Anton De Pasquale, the Erebus teammates in 6th and 7th. Fantastic drive by De Pasquale. He is showing, aside from the Sunday at Tasmania where Jack LeBrock was extremely impressive, De Pasquale's been the most consistent rookie so far, and he was faster than David Reynolds, and Reynolds would later credit him for his good result on the Sunday. Will Davison, fantastic result for Milwaukee Racing, 23 red. Bit of a loss as to what happened to them on the Sunday. They were back down in the 20s, but good result. Scott Pye, consistent top 10 so far this year, and Tim Slade wrapping up the top 10 for race 1. And the most notable drive outside the top 10 on the Saturday race was Fabian Coulthard, who came through the field from last place to eventually place 12th. So to carve up 14 positions, half of the field, great jive, and it kind of, imagine it would have been a bit bittersweet for him, because he would have been imagining what might have been if he did start on the front row alongside his teammate. But now, into the main controversy from the Saturday race, Jamie Whincup placing second, but later not disqualified, but given the equivalent of a drive-through penalty, 38 seconds, for releasing his pit speed limiter early in the first round of pit stops. And the onboard footage confirmed that indeed it was the case. It would have been the tiniest gain. There barely would have been anything in it, but as Mark Dutton said on the Sunday, a rule is a rule. Jamie Whincup broke the rule. I do think a 38-second penalty was probably a bit harsh. Maybe just a 25-point penalty might have been sufficient, but this dropped him from 2nd to 14th on the Saturday and cost him dearly in the championship. Now onto the Sunday race, and for this one, it was Scott McLaughlin again on pole position from David Reynolds, the top two in the championship at the moment, starting on the front row. Pretty cool recipe, and off the start, again pretty close between the front runners, but this time Scott McLaughlin was able to block off the move around the outside with Reynolds slotting in behind, and this race was pretty calm up until about lap 10, where James Courtney, who unfortunately had what was later said to be a transaxle failure, and that was extremely disappointing for him. He was in the top 5 in the championship heading into this weekend, and his pace was pretty poor anyway. So Walkinshaw showing that they still do have some work to do. They've had a pretty fantastic start to the year compared to last year, so they've still got some work to do. But this led to the first round of pit stops ultimately very early compared to Saturday's race, and this gave the teams a bit of an opportunity to split their strategies, with the safety car not being called immediately after the accident. So some teams brought their drivers in immediately anticipating the safety car, and others left the drivers out until the safety car was actually called. And as I said, this let teams like Shell V-Power and Red Bull split their drivers and as to not double stack them. Unfortunately, Anton De Pasquale, one of the standouts from Saturday, did double stack behind his teammate Reynolds. Not particularly well thought out by Erebus, and he dropped back to 18th. But apart from that, the majority of the field stayed in similar positions, except for the Nissans, who again went for a very aggressive strategy, with Rick Kelly leading after this round of pit stops and Michael Caruso, one of the other quick Nissans, in third place. They were obviously extremely underfueled, and for a while there actually it looked like Rick Kelly could be on for the win, as he was told to increase the gap to about 3 seconds to David Reynolds behind. Scott McLaughlin had fallen back to 4th place after another stuff-up from Team Penske, as again he was meant to come out in front of Rick Kelly, Michael Caruso and David Reynolds. However, the team, perhaps not watching enough what was going on around them and focusing too much on the numbers, overfueled his car compared to everyone else, but in doing that lost track position, and he was in 4th place. So he had a bit of work to do, but because he was overfueled, it was still not bad, but still obviously some work to do for Shell V-Power Racing. But Nissan, very impressive, leading away after the first round of pit stops. Now the race was, not going to lie, it was pretty boring, sort of around this mid-stint. not too much was going on, but I will take that any day after the disaster that was last year's rounds. But it was Scott McLaughlin out of the front runners who pulled the trigger first on the second run of pit stops, aiming to perform the undercut, particularly on David Reynolds, who responded the next lap. Rick Kelly, who was leading beforehand, was caught out in this. It initially looked like Nissan had just not responded to the undercut and that it was their fault, but the team manager Scott Sinclair later confirmed that in order to be able to put in the designated 140 litres of petrol that they need in order to comply with the regulations, he needed to run out a bit longer, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to comply with that. So a bit unfortunate for Rick Kelly, but he was still solidly in third place, as he was the day before. And this left Scott McLaughlin and David Reynolds to battle it out for the win. Now, Reynolds actually was able to come out in front of Scott McLaughlin in the pit stops, but due to his cold tyres, McLaughlin did his now trademark move, really, down the inside of turn 2, but David Reynolds holding it on the outside at turn 3 and diving it back up the inside at turn 4. And I think, despite the fact he ultimately came second, this was a fantastic effort from David Reynolds and perhaps disproving some of the doubts that were placed on him after Adelaide at turn 9, where he didn't defend from Shane Van Gisbergen on cold tyres at the Sunday race. But ultimately, McLaughlin proving too strong again, performing an identical move as he did on Jamie Whincup down the inside of turn 2. A bit more forceful this time, but still ultimately fair racing, and he got the move done to take 2 wins from 2 at Phillip Island. 2 poles, 2 wins, championship lead. It doesn't get that much better than that for Scott McLaughlin. So as McLaughlin, Reynolds and Rick Kelly completed the podium, behind him it was Fabian Coulthard, who, pretty solid race from him, started on the second row, I believe, and finished there. So he's back in the top 10 of the championship, but still not a great start to the year for him. Michael Caruso in third, backing up an impressive performance from the Nissans this weekend. Shane Van Gisbergen ultimately came 6th on a day where Red Bull just had no pace, which is very unusual to see from them. They left Shane Van Gisbergen out long in the second stint so he would be able to charge back up the field in the final stint, but not without more controversy with his teammate Craig Lowndes, who he nudged coming out of the penultimate corner and ultimately put him off the track and perhaps cost him a spot to Michael Caruso. So perhaps a bit of tension between Van Gisbergen and Lowndes after this weekend, particularly with Craig Lowndes perhaps being a bit screwed over by Triple Eight, but ultimately he would finish 7th. Lowndes, Chaz Mostert in 8th. Not a bad effort for Tickford, another top 10. Jamie Whincup in 9th. I don't think anyone would have seen that one coming after his performance on the Saturday. And this was a pretty disastrous weekend for Whincup, where he came away effectively with a 14th and a 9th place. And I think he'll be more concerned with the Sunday, where he didn't have the pace to fight anyone. He was quite weak. And Garth Tander putting in a typical Garth Tander drive to climb 5 spots from 15th to 10th. And in terms of drives outside the top 10 that are noteworthy, Nick Percat is the main one, who came up from last on the grid, where it looked like he was having a lot of troubles with the splitter on the front of the ZB, as was Lee Holdsworth in the Preston Hire car, but with a slightly tacky-looking Tim Slade-esque bumper on the front of his car, he surprised, I think, the whole team by not just reaching the 75% distance as they were initially planning, but he ultimately came home in 13th, and also Andre Heimgartner behind him in 14th climbed 6 spots. So, as I said at the beginning of this, not the 2 most exciting races. I still think race 3 at Albert Park, where Scott Pye won, has been the standout race of the year so far, but pretty solid, no tyre blowouts. Scott McLaughlin now has a 60-point lead in the championship, and that'll be pretty crucial. He'll be wanting redemption after the disappointment of 2017 for him. So that's pretty much been my wrap-up of the Phillip Island weekend. I hope you enjoyed. I'll be covering the rest of the Supercars season, and until the next round at Barbagallo, I will catch you later.